Well, you'll get there. Something else about the states that I wanted to bring up that was kind of cool is that New York City voted to set a minimum pay for Uber and Lyft drivers. Now, have you tried Uber or Lyft out yet in Edmonton?
You know what? I still haven't, but I just listened to a podcast.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, that's called Afford Anything.
Hmm.
It's a great podcast. Highly recommend it. And they interviewed a guy who blogs about Uber and Lyft, and he drives for them, and he sets up websites where Uber and Lyft drivers can share information and how to game the system. Fascinating, absolutely fascinating. But I haven't
Cool.
tried it yet.
Well, I mean, the problem with it is, depending on where you live, it can actually be a really bad deal for you.
Yeah.
So, for example, every time I go down to Tijuana, I always get an Uber, and it is so cheap. One time I
Really?
took an Uber that took 45 minutes to get me from the border to this taco place that I really like,
Yeah.
by the racetrack, and it was like $3 American.
That Tijuana racetrack.
Yeah, yes.
Sounds
The Hipódromo.
sketchy.
If you guys know what I'm talking about, it's Taco Naso in the Hipódromo. It is so good. It's worth the $3 in an Uber
And
if you
it's not
cross over.
dangerous by the racetrack.
No, no, it's like a horse race.
Yeah,
But yeah, it's so much cheaper there, and so people there they still have to pay for gas, and the price of gas
for
isn't
sure.
cheaper in Tijuana, and
Oh,
their cars still have to be nice, and they're still spending their time. But say, for example, if you're on Sunset Boulevard in Los Angeles and you try to go from one place to another, like say you're trying
yeah,
to go to the Grove, it's
yeah,
gonna be like $10 for such a short amount of time, and
yeah.
then there 45 minutes for $3. So
But a
that's kind of
taxi would be more.
a taxi would be more, you're right.
Yeah.
But you see, the problem with Uber drivers is they're not making a good wage depending on where they are. And in fact, I had a buddy over last night that's an Uber driver full time in Koreatown here, and
Mm.
he says that sometimes he'll just drive up to San Francisco, just all day
To make
long
more
and just
money.
make more money and then drive back and pick people up on the way back to Los Angeles because he can make more money
Wow.
up there than they can here.
Why is
So
that? Is it
um,
demand?
I think it's the demand's a little bit higher.
Less
I'm not sure
drivers?
how they're. Yeah, probably everybody wants to use it there. But the cool thing about New York is they finally put their foot down and they said, okay, we need to regulate this because there's a lot of people getting ripped off. And so now everyone gets paid 26.51 an hour, which is pretty good American dollars. It's like 30 bucks Canadian an hour to drive a car.
Yeah.
And what that translates out to after you pay for gas, wear and tear on the car, it's about 17.22 American or like 22 bucks Canadian an hour to drive in New York City, which is pretty cool. Um,
Wow.
but they also made it a little bit more difficult to become a driver there.
Mm-hmm.
So they don't let just anybody go out anymore. You have to apply, and it's a whole thing, and there's a wait list. So it's not like right now I could just apply, and probably
Yeah.
next week I could start driving here. But in New York, it's a little bit more involved.
Well, New York's been very controversial when it comes to Uber because they've had a very protected monopoly on their taxi drivers. In fact,
Right.
I believe it was $1 million was the average that they were paying for a taxi license, and you get a special license plate. And those were bequeathed in wills. And then all of a sudden Uber comes along.
What?
Yeah, yeah, it was bequeathed
Wow.
in wills. And then Uber comes along and says, um, nope, sorry, we're just gonna get some schmuck that he's got a decent car, he'll have a nice car, but he's gonna be driving down the streets of New York and plugging up the streets, which is already congested. And then
Yeah.
imagine you just paid $1 million for your license to drive a taxi.
I'd be so
Yeah.
mad.
So it's interesting to me that New York is finally embracing it and saying, okay, if you're going to be here, they need to make a living wage. And a
Yeah.
living wage in New York, they're saying is what, 17 to 26 bucks?
Well, and see, that's the problem. I mean, you're not going to live in Manhattan with 17.22 an hour, but
No.
at least it would be enough that you'd be able to commute in.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's fascinating stuff.